The really scandalous thing about fascism is that it is basically the sole repository of the aesthetic in modern politics. So liberalism just completely seems in principle to avoid the aesthetic. And communism has these clumsy sub-fascist aesthetics. And fascism, the more fascist it is, the more it actually has extraordinary aesthetics. In attempting to sort of obviously that kind of all-round global post-war denunciation of fascism, the most ridiculous part of that was the attempt to pretend that it was in some sense aesthetically impoverished or ridiculous, or an attempt to say it was just all of this kind of absurd neo-realist statues and actually kind of rejected all the interesting currents in modern art and everything of this kind. And I just think that misses the point so much in terms of the fact that it was just, I mean, not only are almost all important literary figures of the period just pretty much fully on board Fascism Express, but it's the inherent aestheticism of the politics. The rallies, the uniforms, the insignia, there's just attention always to aesthetic impact that is just completely unmatched anywhere else. And so there is this thing that, like, the defeat of fascism, the post-war world, let's say, there is this kind of essential core of de-aestheticization about it. Which is, and I had no idea really. I could see them all coming up in different orders. Um, so it was like nihilism, will to power, eternal recurrence, and Overman. I like bread and butter stuff, obviously. But a lot there, and I think we've done pretty good about digging into will to power. Um, and we've touched on Overman, but I think we've got a lot more to do on Overman. And we haven't really talked about nihilism at all. And we haven't done eternal recurrence. Um, and I think we should just do a little eternal recurrence stretch, just because it's like very structurally important to all kinds of stuff, and it's weird. Um, like obviously the total, if you gather together everything Nietzsche had written ever on the eternal recurrence, it's like just a few pages. It's really not a lot of material. And yet he's so emphatic about this being the key to his whole philosophy. And, there's been so much like Nietzscheanism in the sense of people like deeply influenced by him. And I would say, I mean, I'm probably a bit influenced, particularly by Deleuze here, but there's a tendency to kind of have a sense that there's a really inane reading of Eternal Recurrence, and you have to do something else. And at the same time, kind of with bad conscience, like all the moves that Deleuze makes are like interesting and even on some level plausible, but at the same time you feel that he doesn't really believe that he's actually reconstructing this thought in a way that is close to the way Nietzsche was conceiving it. And that actually Deleuze thinks that the way Nietzsche himself was conceiving it probably was not very impressive from his point of view. So I think that's a really crucial part to this, because there is a kind of really, it's not entirely uninteresting, but it's a disappointing construction of the eternal recurrence, I think. Um, and it's one that weirdly does quite a lot of philosophical work, but still falls short. So like to just do that first, to do the kind of most, the lamest version of eternal recurrence you really can do. Um, because, and I take it like, okay, Zarathustra is certainly not the only place he talks about this, but it's like, I take it that that's the kind of place you have to start. It's like, it's the vision and the riddle. It's where it is this visionary insight that I think is pretty much always being implicitly referenced when Nietzsche talks about it elsewhere. And he's got this annoying dwarf on his shoulder, and he reaches the gate moment from which two roads stretch in each direction, forward and backwards, and both of these roads are endless. Um, and into Deleuze's credit, he kind of, because the dwarf makes some remark, you know, even eternity is a circle, or some kind of flip little remark. I can't remember it exactly. Um, and Zarathustra says to the dwarf, "Oh, don't be an asshole. Like it's more interesting than that." So there's already the implicit thing in Nietzsche that actually there's a lame misunderstanding sort of inherent in the presentation that you should not accept. So that's a kind of that's a little point for Deleuze there, I think. Um, but um, okay, so I'll take one sort of step outside of this just for a minute, because I think the most important or helpful short remark he makes about eternal recurrence is where he says, um, in his will to power notes, or the notes that were compiled for him. So very, very, very short, one sentence little note, number 1061 in his book, where he says, the most extreme ways of thinking, the mechanistic and the platonic, are reconciled as ideals in the eternal recurrence. Um, and this is like, I think, it's close to the sort of mechanistic teleological discussion. It's certainly close, or not close, but exactly two different aspects of the notion of eternity. So that one notion of eternity is that which is just outside time. It's just the negative of time. And it's the one that's, Nietzsche obviously calls Christianity Platonism for the people. And I think he thinks that Christian metaphysics of time, in this sense, are Platonic, that the Christian eternity is this negation of time. It's that which is just outside or beyond time. And the mechanistic notion of eternity is just unending duration. So it's not outside time at all. It's just time to infinity. Um, and in this, the vision and the riddle, I think you have to assume that both of these elements are involved. The second one obviously has to be involved. Like he's got the two roads, they stretch infinitely in both directions. He says, how can how can this not involve eventually repeating the same situation? How can this not ultimately be a cycle? I mean, as people have said, it's not that isn't in itself an enormously persuasive argument. Like you certainly you can have non-repetitive cycles, even though he then in 1067 of the will to power, he has a much more like he he builds a whole bunch of stuff into his notion of the universe. He says, bum, 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 bum. Sorry, 1 second. Yes. Here, can sorry, just read a few sentences because it's kind of interesting. He says, "And do you know what I take the world to be? Shall I hold up my mirror to it? The world is a monster of energy without beginning or end, so a fixed and invariable magnitude of energy." So this is like very natural scientific, you know, no more, no less, which has never expanded, merely transformed, of unalterable size as a whole, whose budget is without either expenses or losses, but without gains or earnings, surrounded and bounded by nothingness. Um, I could go on. The whole thing is quite interesting, but he's decided that matter and space are finite and that time is infinite, which seems, I mean, what's the grounds of that? Like, it's a bit hard. Again, like going from Kant, like why would space and time and even substance are all just categories of the understanding? So, why does some get projected to infinity and others decided on finitude? That's all transcendental dialectic and antinomy for Kant. It's not as an argument. It certainly needs some justification. But if you just go with what he's saying there, even then you actually don't get mechanical recurrence. So the mechanical recurrence is something that you just have to assume. Um, and then finally, on this very pedestrian level of discussion of this thought, which is what we're on, I think there's the interesting question, like, so is it that time is a circle? Like, that's to say, is it that actually there's just this one cycle of time? Or is it that there's a cycle of material process in an endless Newtonian dimension of time? Is it that is eternal recurrence supposed to be? Is it Newtonian in that sense? I mean, that would be very weird. It would be very like it would really have lost the plot a little bit on transcendental philosophy if that was what we were being told. It is. Um, but anyway, like I think even on that first level, what the where we're at with this thing is that you somehow in the eternal currents you're supposed to have this inherent integral conception of eternity in these two completely different forms. It's supposed to be its temporal eternity, well, both as the atemporality and as unending temporality that are somehow captured together in a single thought. And this is this visionary state that again, it's this is kind of slightly paradoxical sense. Maybe it's not exactly a paradox. It's like, so at some point in time of endless recurrent time, there is this privileged moment where there is a kind of vision of the whole. There is this absolute transcendental insight into the notion of time. And then we can say, still at this pedestrian, banal level, and more like we goes in his notes very emphatically, not just in his notes, but also elsewhere in, like, I think, Twilight the Idols, um, that it does this thing that it is selective. That's to say, it's supposed to basically be this mega weapon, this ultimate weapon that crushes the weak and exalts the strong. Like all the, I mean, Deleuze's thing, which I think has a lot, it's a very coherent reading on this level where he says, like, that Nietzsche's got the thing that the strong need protecting from the weak, that history tends paradoxically to the kind of uh, the triumph of the weak over the strong. That for Nietzsche in particular, that is what Christianity is as a phenomenon. And you need this, what if I was going to be awkward about it? I would say this miraculous moment to upend that whole kind of strategic inevitability that is just like, so for Nietzsche, certainly it's like, it's the anti Christian. Just to take that in the sense of his model of the kind of defeat of the strong by the weak is Christianity. That's his concrete model of that whole process. And then, um, what is the end of Christianity? Well, obviously, we know the end of Christianity for him is nihilism. These 200 years of nihilism, and the eternal recurrence is the most nihilistic thought. So it's like the thought of the eternal recurrence, which is, and now we're back in this Nietzschean mode that we're not actually talking about the nature of things. We're not even talking about any kind of transcendental structure of reality. What we're talking about is the operational value of a thought relative to the will to power. And the operational value of the thought of eternal recurrence is that it is intolerable to the sick. Like, because it's saying it's a picture of the universe, of reality, in which there is no relief. There is no redemption. There's no salvation. The fact it's a circle, the fact it's a kind of, in some sense, whichever of the two senses of a circle that we're actually ending up with, means that there's no getting out of it. It has no escape. There's no redemption. It's just on and on and on and on and on with this thing. And if this thing is intolerable, if you are sick and need to be redeemed from it, then eternal recurrence is saying no. And then that is the moment of selection. Um, so yeah, I mean that's long enough on a ramble. I'm slightly losing track of where I was, kind of what I saw as the next step of that. But it's basically because I want to get us onto this thing about time, Nietzsche and time, and what he's really saying about time. And obviously this has to be the starting point of that.
So some of my preliminary thoughts, regarding eternal recurrence. I think it's interesting because in some ways, especially the way that you framed it, it almost brings me back to the sort of idea of the like Einstein's three sphere, for instance. You know, not exactly the same, but there seems to be some parallels of Nietzsche almost prescribing this scientific description to time and space and the way that the one quote you mentioned, I like wrote it down very briefly, but I didn't get it perfectly. Sort of reminds me almost like the second law of thermodynamics, and it's interesting that Nietzsche is almost. I guess he had access to Newtonian physics, so it's not completely out of the realm of having some frame to build off of. But it's interesting the way that this philosophical sort of description of things, mirrors very very closely the actual physics behind it. It sort of reminds me of when Bergson, Henri Bergson tried to refute or something like one of Einstein's theories, and everyone was calling it stupid. And then Einstein was like, actually, it's not so bad. But anyway, but going back to the actual, I think yeah, you remember that old story? I don't know. It was a funny little thing I read once about them.
Yeah,
But
yeah. There's a really good book about the two of them actually, but yeah, I can't get it at the moment. So it's just tantalizing. But a Bergson Einstein book, and they had a certain amount of interaction for sure. That was quite intriguing.
I'll have to look that up. Maybe
Definitely
I can find
mutually
it.
respectful.
Sorry, what
Yeah.
was the last thing you said?
Oh, yeah, definitely mutually respectful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I got the sense of that.
But sorry, but just on this, just very quickly, like, on what you're saying, because actually, I I don't even know what Boltzmann's dates are, or how this fits in, or I'm pretty sure it's like Nietzsche isn't a Boltzmann reader, but Boltzmann's notion of time is actually like you're suggesting. It's very close to that particular description. I'm not saying it should be privileged. That it's the fun, obviously the will to power is a really weird, and it's like, I think I find it hard not to think about it a little bit like the Bible in the sense that it's like, it's put together in this crazy way by other people, and lots of people are suspicious about these people and suspicious about their agenda and all of this kind of thing. And it's like, in that sense, like something like, well, like the Bible has this historical compilation process, and you can look into it and be very skeptical and say, you know, it's just a set of historical accidents that have come together in this kind of document, whatever. Um, but at the same time, there's something about it that has this kind of deep sense of canonicity about it, and this particular fragment is quite long, and it's the final one. It's the final fragment in the whole of this book, and it's very kind of physicalistic in this particular 19th century sense, because Bergson, not Bergson, Boltzmann, yeah, he obviously has this huge problem where it's like there's a second law of thermodynamics, statistical mechanics, which he's basically invented, and it's like, so everything is running down, and it's like, well, how is that? Isn't that just weird? Like, we're at a particular state, everything's running down, it all goes into some direction. How was it ever not run down? Like there's no mechanism in statistical mechanics, no very obvious first order mechanism for anything not to run down. So it's like somehow you end up in this state that's anomalous in terms of its own principles. And like Nietzsche, Boltzmann's kind of Boltzmann's being just kind of he's just assuming atheism. Like the thing about Nietzsche and his atheism, and there's lots about this anti-Christianity stuff to get into, but one of it is just he assumes it because of the fact that Schopenhauer assumes it, and Schopenhauer radically assumes it. He doesn't really make many arguments very specifically. He thinks it's beneath argument, and so Nietzsche, who's coming, Nietzsche's at the end of the 19th century. Schopenhauer's at the beginning of the 19th century. It's like he thinks, look, if it was just risible for Schopenhauer, I'm not going to. It would be absurd for me to pretend that it's anything less than risible for me. That's I think that's just a huge implicit argument in him. And Boltzmann too. I don't know really what his religious ideas were generally, but they were definitely like in this model. It's like a radical version of Laplace's. I have no need of that hypothesis. Like it's just assumes this atheistic model. So he's not saying, oh, good. It's like this anomalous singularity at the beginning of the universe that can't be explained by physics. This is a theological argument. It doesn't, as far as I'm aware, occur to him to say that. So he says, well, how the hell can this happen? And he says, look, in infinite time, every possible every possible permutation of reality happens, and this extreme state of negative entropy isn't impossible. It's just extremely improbable. And improbabilities, however extreme, dissolve in eternity. So I think that final step is like very much Nietzsche in his scientific mechanistic mode. I think it's the same. He's saying like in eternity, you the rules break down. Like in his case, the thing he's trying to do is not like Boltzmann's thing. How do you get this anomalous, massive negative entropy? It's just simply how would you get exactly the same situation? But at a certain level of just logical abstraction, it's the same. It's the same thing that's being done. That they're saying this makes no sense at all, except that nonsense, that near impossibility, is soluble in eternity. Um, and so that's what eternity is doing for him, and what he's wanting to. Sorry, I said this was going to be short, and I'm just rambling on, but just to repeat that the function for him is it definitively annihilates all possibility of redemption. That's the function of eternity for him, and what he thinks it's eternal recurrence is doing. I'm not saying that's the only level of it, but that's like the critical polemical function of it. So sorry, I interrupted you for that.
No, no, totally fine. That was really, I mean, kind of changed some of the things I was thinking about because I've sort of thought about this before as well. Contra. You have a lot of, especially, let's say maybe continental thinkers that coming from the Trish, maybe even before that. I forget who it was that talks about it, but like the perfect world theory. Well, for this to be perfect, it must have had a creator, and then you have infinity. Well, with infinity and all possibilities within infinity, then that sort of breaks down that argument as well. And it sort of reminded me, I think it was Feinberg, I can't remember for sure, who was one of the first people to come up with like um, like the quantum dimensional theory or whatever, that every single possible outcome of your life exists in some other dimension, and that what you see as free will is just the slightest difference. Like I put my finger down or I don't, and there's all these different things that could be involved
Yeah,
with that.
yeah. It's like that point you're making. I think the quantum multiverse argument is that it's what seems like free will is actually just multiverse perspectivalism. Because if there's an option in the multiverse, every version happens. So if there's any way that you end up strangling the neighbor's dog, there's going to be a multiverse option where you strangle the neighbor's dog. It's like it's not it's like in the multiverse everything happens. So it's like yeah, um, yeah. Sorry to interrupt you yet again, but
No, no worries at
yeah,
all. No, it's all very interesting. I guess for me, one of the things I've been playing around with recently, again, sort of more conceptually rather than as like an actual descriptor, but the idea of theories regarding simulated universe. One thing I find difficult is within this infinite time that we are the actual life, so to speak. I think this theory, of like ancestor simulations, for instance, simulations within simulations, so to speak.
yeah,
I kind of subscribe to that because now I actually also like the idea that, well, we are, I guess, the first life in this specific multiverse or whatever, and with infinite time. Yeah, I mean, something as crazy as thermodynamics could come about. But one way I see it, and I've heard different theories from physicists. There's a book I've been meaning to read. I'll probably read it sometime soon by Marvin Vopson, I believe his name is, called like Second Law of Infodynamics. And, one of his theories is that the way that information works in the universe is not consistent with the law of thermodynamics. And I think, and again, I still have to read it, but I think the main thesis has something to do with the weight and energy that information holds. And maybe there's like some sort of argument that that information ought to have a lot more weight and energy than it actually does. And then, anyway, but the point being, I'm kind of sort of getting into this whole simulation theory thing, and one of the implications of that, again, free will comes into play. Well, do we have free will? Do we have agency within this eternal recurrence? And one of the things I sort of said is, well, we have to treat whatever reality we're in as reality on a pragmatic level, but then on a more abstract level, one of the things you were mentioning, especially in relation to these different, mechanistic time, and then I guess eternal time. I forget what word to use exactly. My notes are all over the place. But one thing I've been kind of messing around with, I'm going to write an essay called "The Schizo Theory of Reality" because it's kind of stupid, but then kind of makes sense in a weird way. But one of the things I've been coming up with, it's going to look silly, but it's like, I don't know if it's going to show because I have my background here. Let's see. No, it's not going to show, so let's describe it. I sort of, one of the frames of trying to sort of think of time that I've been playing around with is the idea of like an expanding circle, where there's that old like Nordic sort of what's the word? I guess like symbol of the I think it's like a snake or serpent or dragon whose tail is in its own mouth, and I think it sort of has to do
Yeah,
with
Ouroboros.
right. And there was this great line in I think it was a poem by Yukio Mishima, who of course I very much like, where he's talking about that, describing the universe, and he doesn't give any explicit diagnostic of that. But one way I sort of see it is this sphere which feeds into itself. So you have the beginning because you have the end, but within that beginning and end, that top point, it's like constantly getting bigger and expanding. So it's like you have this eternal recurrence in the sense that again, this is very schizo. I have no technical thing to back it up. It's just a thought I've had for a few years. But the beginning is furnished by the wellspring of the beginning, or sorry, the latest point, and it's expanding within that. Not that I really want to discuss that, but just sort of the different ways I've been trying to approach eternal recurrence, so to speak. But um, going back to Deleuze, I think one way I've read eternal recurrence is, of course, as something anti-Hegelian. Um, right? I guess that's a little bit more pragmatic, and use the word pedestrian. Maybe it's the one other pedestrian way of talking about it. But in rejecting this Hegelian absolute ideal end of history, so to speak, in some ways both negating and reaffirming agency at the same time. Because I guess the mechanistic aspect of it um, would be where you have some form of agency, but the way I sort of see eternal recurrence as well in a more pragmatic way, less abstractly, is a spiritualization of the samsara. Where you embrace this cyclical nature, and it's not cyclical in the Guinonian sense, obviously. I don't believe in that sort of cyclical thing, but cyclical in the sense that there is no teleological endpoint, and that we are an ever expanding circle conceptually, where there is no salvation, paradise, or endpoint, and it's a spiritualization of that cycle, which creates more desires which need to be fulfilled. You can see that as will to power. You're developing more instruments uh, of attaining goals, creating goals, without an endpoint. That's kind of the way I've perhaps pragmatically attempted to talk about eternal recurrence. And you're talking about more of the abstract things, which are very interesting as well. And I wonder maybe if one day I can sort of try to fuse the two. But before going on, I guess briefly I'll just say, like, one of the reasons why you get Deleuze called like a crypto fascist, for instance, right? Especially compared to like earlier Marxist thinking. You probably saw this in my leftist Nietzschean video where Essential Salts and I were talking about Lusordo and Lukács. I think Zizek says the same thing about Deleuze, but um, without that Hegelian sort of ontology, so to speak, or cosmology, treating eternal recurrence as such does lend itself to whatever sort of nominalization within that spiritualization of the samsara. So, like, one word I wrote down, I don't know how much bearing this has, I just thought it was funny, is fascist rhizomatics, because I feel like that's one of the illusions, especially anti-postmodern, anti postmodernist leftists, like more orthodox Marxists, have of Deleuze, is you could just as easily become fascist, but nominally, not in a Gentilian fascist way, but maybe like an earlier, like Sorelian form of fascism. But I don't know where I'm going with that, but just some preliminary thoughts on eternal recurrence, both with the pragmatic and the abstract, and then maybe going forward, what I would attempt to do in my own work is sort of see if there's some sort of synthesis there. But then again, I think there's also the issue of Heidegger again with revealing, like ultimately all the I guess it's almost better to deal with the conceptual in some ways, especially if you're coming from a philosophical lens, because you're going to have a new Einstein eventually who's going to further clear the lens, and then we can probably from there create more abstractions out of that. I don't know what I'm saying, but are you sort of following? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have to confess, like, I try to sort of follow a bit what the left is going on about at its highest levels. But this particular thing, like, there's a sort of, I find, unbelievably obnoxious French philosopher called Alain Badiou.
I'm
I
not.
don't know whether you know him. He's, you know, an unspeakable regression, as far as I'm concerned, into a kind of just absolute paleo leftism that I thought had died, and clearly not. And he's on record of just accusing Deleuze and Guattari of what he calls, based on this rhizomatic thing. Uh, I'm going to forget there's an adjective. It's the something fascism of the potato. Uh, I mean, I don't know whether potatoes. I don't think they're rhizomatic, actually, technically speaking. But that I think that's the idea he's trying to make. But I don't really get it. I mean, kind of, I can see lots of reasons why you would just really not like Deleuze and Guattari and what they're up to. But the fascist accusation really, to me, is straining it a little bit. I mean, because literally they could not be more anti-hierarchical, and it's just pretty much impossible. If they could have been more anti-hierarchical, they would have been. Everything they're doing is about collapsing hierarchies, flatness. That's the just drive all the time. And so you're saying that you can have, I get the thing that Badiou's not even saying that actually there's some kind of hierarchy and therefore they're fascist, but he's saying that somehow anti-hierarchical philosophy is intrinsically fascist. That to me is like, yes, the guy is a kind of Stalinist freak of almost unspeakable evil, and but I do think that that is what is happening there, and it's just really gone. But yes.
Yeah, if I could just break in, one thing I was thinking in regards to that is, even in regards to fascism, I think I've had a few talks about this. I don't know if I talked about it on my channel or from somebody else's channel. Like, what is fascism, right? And I don't even think that. I think in some ways you can actually justify what this guy is saying if you take a more uh, a less strict prescriptive of what fascism is, and you see it more of an umbrella. Especially like it's not Gentilian fascism. Clearly, it's not later stage fascism where the state there's nothing in out of the state, everything's within the state. Blah blah. But like again, I think it goes back to Sorelian sort of fascism, or even like proto-fascist people like D'Annunzio were very anti-hierarchical in a lot of ways, and even the early fascist party or combat was in some ways it was very anti-hierarchical. for instance, you see many of these regional capo, I think they were called, just like, in the mafia, but they had their own word, like capos or whatever, of different fascist combats. And if Mussolini was pissing them off, they'd go to his presidential palace and they'd intimidate him. And it was almost very anti-hierarchical in the sense that you didn't have this Führer principle that you did in Germany, right? You didn't have this strict sort of thing. It was very fluid at first. And I think there's probably a Sorelian influence in that, maybe an influence of just Mussolini coming from an early socialist background. But I sort of get what the critiques are of Deleuze and Guattari in terms of like calling them crypto fascists. Obviously, they're not fascist, but in some ways, some brands of fascism reduced to more of like, especially if you take what Bataille has to say about fascism. He's very much criticizing the hierarchical elements, the totalitarian elements. But then there's an aspect of it where he's looking at the ritualistic, frenzied sort of violent, like orgiastic violence that you see in the early, fascist movements. As this sort of very I don't know if I'd call it relativistic, but it's very much more of like a vibe than anything else. It's these young guys, drunk off of the first war and all these grievances that they have, and they just want to march on the fume. It's very irrational and very non-productive at first. And I think you could lend the rhizomatic in some ways to something approximating that. So I don't know where I'm going exactly, but I could sort of. It's not that obviously they're not fascists. Anyone that calls them actually fascists, it's stupid. But I do see this idea, like I said, fascist rhizomatics. It's where without that Hegelian or even Marxist material dialectic ontology, so to speak. I don't know if that would be the right way of framing it. There's really anything you could do, um, and I guess that's where that critique comes from. So I don't know. I guess it's not as crazy to me, I think, just because I could see a different reading of it. And again, I'm not struck. You and I are not stuck in this, leftist, PC culture where we're trying to fit into those, like, oh shit, fascism. I'm afraid to say the word, but like looking at it from a more bird's eye view. Anyway, but I
Yeah,
don't know.
yeah, yeah.
You get where I'm coming from.
No, good comment. I mean, this actually also, I don't have much to to add on this, but it is a point of rethreading back to this uh, the dropped aesthetics question, because the really scandalous thing about fascism, obviously, is that it is basically the sole repository of the aesthetic in modern politics. Like um, so so liberalism just completely seems in principle to avoid the aesthetic. And communism has these clumsy sub-fascist aesthetics,
Like the new
and
Soviet.
fascism, the more fascist it is, the more it actually has extraordinary aesthetics. I mean, it's like the in attempting to sort of, obviously, the kind of all round global post-war denunciation of fascism. The most ridiculous part of that was the attempt to pretend that it was in some sense aesthetically impoverished or ridiculous, or you know it's like an attempt to say it was just all of this kind of absurd neo-realist statues, and actually kind of rejected all the interesting currents in modern art and everything of this kind. And I just think that misses the point so much, in terms of the fact that it was just, I mean, not only are almost all important literary figures of the period just pretty much fully on board Fascism Express, but it's like um, just that it's the inherent aestheticism of the politics. The rallies, the uniforms, the insignia. There's just attention always to aesthetic impact that is just completely unmatched anywhere else. And so there is this thing that, like, the defeat of fascism, the post-war world, let's say, there is this kind of essential core of de-aestheticization about it. It's like there has been this just like implosion of the aesthetic because of that. Um, so I mean, I guess like if I was going to say, oh, but no one's dealing with it. I mean, I guess the people who are dealing with it are the kind of internet internet 1488ers and his characters who just like it's living on as a kind of mimetic virulence, despite the fact that it's been completely crushed as a sort of geopolitical option.
Yeah, I think even there though, I don't even consider those 1488 sort of like like national social. I don't consider them fascists because even doctrinally, there's nothing fascistic to me about Nazism. I find it very different from fascism, especially even in later fascism with Gentile and especially of earlier Sorelian fascism. But without going too much into that, because I think that we sort of tied up eternal recurrence. The sort of last things I'll say, and maybe we could. I think this might be a good place to move on to the Overman, the Übermensch from there. I think it's sort of there's a bridge there, so to speak. But the last things I'll sort of say on that, um, I totally agree, and I guess the question becomes, especially when people try to say, "Well, is this Nietzschean? Is this not Nietzschean?" Um, like, well, it's obviously more complicated, especially when you look at early fascist figures, like for example, Marinetti, and then Bowtie, not Bataille, for the listener. I forget his first name. It's like Giuseppe or something like that. These guys were, Marinetti obviously being a futurist, but Bowtie being a modernist who wrote extensively. He has like 20 different books and long essays. I'm going to learn Italian just so I could translate his works because they're all. That's another thing. There's so many great Italian works that are untranslated right now. Unfortunately, one of I work with a guy Lance Legion on a small book publishing company, DVX Publishing, and our Italian translator was actually killed by Moroccan migrants. We have a video sort of commemorating him. But me and another friend of his are going to take it up to translate some Italian um, books of philosophy and politics. That's a sort of side thing. But Bowtie, Marinetti, these guys were modernist, futurists. I mean, even Ezra Pound, right, has a lot of you know. His thing is not futurist, but it was inspired by futurism. Obviously Ezra Pound being involved. Casa Pound today, the Italian, sort of continuity fascist movement named after him. Guy like D'Annunzio. So it's a lot. It's interesting, but yeah, aesthetics comes into it, and then with Marxists, like you mentioned, they have to adopt these fascist aesthetics, like in the Soviet Union. Like I said, the new Soviet man is very fascistic. He's supposed to be the strong, handsome, and they're all blonde hair and blue eyed. If you just took away the hammer and sickle, you'd think it was like a Nuremberg rally. And then there's like the statue of the motherland, right? It looks it's beautiful big statue holding up a sword. Anyway, but I'll just leave that there to sort of finish that off. But I think some other things you mentioned you wanted to talk about was you know uh, Overman and then nihilism, and then I probably would try to frame that within positive nihilism as well. But I think it seems better if we go to the Overman first. But what do you think?
Yeah, sure. Let's have an Overman stretch. So, I mean, the time thing is left hanging. I guess the time thing is going to come back a bit in the Overman question. The bit, and you set it up in a good way right at the start. The question about, I mean, very very crudely, and I'm not saying that your formulation was like this, but I think even cruder and therefore maybe more sort of conveniently, it's this question that comes up every now and again about how do you translate Übermensch into English, and it's like there's Superman, which I think was the original option, which implies like it's a kind of boosted human, and then Overman being something beyond man. So the kind of just immediate valence of that option captures, I think, your question. It's like, so how are we? Are we thinking Overman as something is some kind of a human upgrade, or is it something that is just completely beyond that? Um, and I think, honestly, awkwardly, I think Nietzsche talks about it both ways. Sometimes Overman basically is obviously just a boosted human, radically boosted, maybe. I mean, the famous quote is like Caesar with the soul of Christ. So yeah, I mean, I guess with the soul of Christ, like you can put as much metaphysical kind of intensity in that as you want. But I think the general impression is that you're actually dealing with a kind of biological human being of just sort of vastly superior uh, status or whatever. I mean, and then, but on the other hand, there's also, which we've already mentioned already, there's this man is a rope over an abyss, between worm and overman. And so that pushes us like a lot in the opposite tendency, I think. I mean, it's like, so, we're as close to overman as a worm is to us. Um, and that's, interestingly, it's like that take at them again, just to start off at the most pedestrian, is like actually kind of just Darwinian naturalism. Like you can get to that without having to do any of the kind of critical stuff on Darwin that Nietzsche always insists on doing at some point. Like it's just like any evolutionary biologist would probably have to say, yeah, like there's nothing. We're a transitional biological form. Like so, given that they were all going to say, there's the evolution's the progressive and everything that exists is equally evolved and there's maybe no direction to evolution. It's just like kind of in some ways hard to defend, but there's interesting arguments for it. But at the same time, it's like there's nothing that says we're in an end. There's nothing that says like it's reached its climax. Where the climax where the climax evolutionary form. There's nothing in biology that says that. You have to bring something else to the table if you're going to say that. Um, but I think there's even more. I think there's even more extreme potential, and then maybe you're drifting off from Nietzsche a little bit. Then maybe you're stretching it, but I mean, my inclination would be to just say, and I'll stop after this pause, at least after this thing, is just to say, what if you tie Overman and the time question together a bit. And um, and you have problems with a kind of crude temporal schema that has like us leading to the Overman. The Overman being, in some simple sense, a kind of following upon us, and even in some models of what Nietzsche's saying that something we almost do a human project, and you take it that the kind of the path of causality should sort of follow from the sort of magnitude, however you're going to say that, of the being. That it's like if Overman massively preponderates in capability over us, then it should be that the tendency is to run the causality from Overman to us backwards rather than run it forward from us to Overman. And even then, final flip of this is just to say, so, you know, because you're not wanting to kind of engage in temporal prejudice, to conceive of man and overman as coincidental in metaphysical time which would then take us in this circuit back to this thing about the will. Like when we're saying, look, you know, we know at least minimally will doesn't come from the kind of empirical ego. So it comes from something like backstage of that. It comes, the empirical ego is just the performer and the will is running the ego and whatever passes through and alongside the ego. And so, what is that? What is that backstage capability and potential? And in Nietzsche's, like, now getting scientific metaphors, energy, giant ball of energy at some level. Do you put Overman like that? Is Overman actually running things? Or running things more than we are, to the extent that it is more than we are. So yeah, that's my initial kind of Overman meander.
One area I kind of wanted to draw it to, especially in regards to artificial intelligence, uh, as potentially being, synonymous with this evolution. I kind of want to get your perspective on, obviously, in your earlier writings, seeing machinic process as a decentralization from top-down structures to bottom-up structures, and in relation to how the Overman evolves, or Übermensch. I've heard it before that, kind of like as you said, Overman, beyond man. But I've heard Übermensch used in more of a way of, like biologically or even inorganically, being beyond man. Anyway, I guess I want to get your perspective on that decentralization, that top to bottom up, how that relates to the evolution of the Overman, whether in a very practical applied way to Nietzsche, or maybe even take it more abstractly. And you mentioned sometimes we get a little bit beyond Nietzsche, but I think that's fine as well, since that's our task, right? To sort of go beyond that. But yeah, so what's the relationship between decentralization, between top to bottom up, and then with the evolution of the Overman? You sort of hinted this already in one of the last things you said. Can you just kind of extrapolate that and present that sort of relationship?
Yeah. Well, I think, like, my sort of framework today on this is very much like coming out of the Anglo Protestant Whig tradition. It's like, and it's centrally about the notion of the invisible hands, which it has to be plural. It makes no sense of it. Or, as gets called by later, like, kind of radical liberals, like Austrian school economists, spontaneous order. Which is the same. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about decentralized systems. Um, and it's why we would say first the internet, then crypto, then like neural net based AI, all the stuff that works in sort of, you know techno capital, is all on a liberal model, liberal understood, like, deeply, as this lineage of kind of spontaneous order. And so that's a religious tradition on one side, but it's often treated as if it's not. Like, so on the because obviously in that tradition, like, there's Adam Smith, then there's Darwin, like the whole of evolutionary biology is also on this liberal template of this decentralized system where everything arises through spontaneous order. Um, and so, yeah, in direct answer to your question, so, you know, and it's true that that's where I ended up on the Overman thing exactly, is is if it's converted into ideological terms, it's positioning Overman within a liberal tradition. Um, so it is a form, just like, so you're in a market economy and you're an agent and you kind of self-idolizing as an ego. You're something at least a little bit more than that, but also your action is part of this greater formation of will, in the sense that something is being made to happen. There's some kind of process that's, in a certain sense, as it's at least as teleologically intelligible as it is mechanically intelligible. It looks like it's design without a designer. It's bottom up, self organizing process. Um, and so if Overman is a kind of formation of superior will, then it's at least coherent to kind of locate it in the frame. Um, and so but in doing that aim, of course, this is definitionally an English reading of Nietzsche. So Nietzsche would hate and abominate this, I mean, because obviously in his imagination, I think it's like the Overman, in whatever form it's being conceived, is being conceived as this kind of concentrated aristocratic node of decision, like it's being at least metaphorically understood in terms of like traditional human hierarchy. It's the absolute opposite of a liberal notion. um and so this is a kind of deeply unfair English revenge on Nietzsche, really, for all the shade he's cast on the English cultural tradition. Um, because of course he wouldn't agree, and of course most people, as in their understanding of the Iran, would say, like, what the hell are you saying? This is like just the absolute opposite direction. But it's where I have to go. It's where I have to go, because if we're going into this sort of thing about AI, it's like no coincidence that AI starts to work on a liberal model. It starts to work as a decentralized system without top down control, without programming, without the people involved even knowing. After they build it and train it, they then have to try and understand what it is. It's like the absolute opposite of this top down AI model of command control. The over. So if if that's where Overman is coming from for us, because and I'd have to say that's my punt. I have to bet that way, because it's like, yeah, if somehow just biology was just going to continue, if it was just going to be biological survival of the fittest for however many tens of millions of years, then I would think, hey, you're going to end up with somehow some super intelligent biological organism that is to us as we are to a world. Um, but that's not. But what stops that happening isn't anything in the inherent to biology. It's not that sort of biological evolution has run out of steam. It's the fact that techno evolution cuts in and is so vastly more highly accelerated that it just casts biological time frames into complete irrelevance. Um, and surely Overman, if it's going to be anything, has to be recast in those terms. It's like it makes no sense to just have a primarily biological model of what Overman would be, because that stuff has just been blown off the road by something else.
Yeah, I certainly see that. And, obviously, I have my own reservations. Perhaps I'm a Nietzschean cell, as they say, where I have to ride with Nietzsche contra the Anglo way of being. But I totally see where you're coming from. And, it makes a lot of sense. And I have to do some thinking. I had some preliminary thoughts, but I think they're not. I'd have to think about this over the course of a few days based on what I was going to say to that. But for now, yeah, I certainly see that. I don't necessarily know if I want to concede the Anglo reading of Nietzsche. Maybe what's the word I'm looking for? In a
No, that's
biased.
great. That's great because he's no longer able to defend himself from this just abusive thing that I'm doing. So it's very noble and just that you're able to hold the line in his place.
That's the hope, right? I just got to do some more reading. It's very good, but I guess what I'm saying is I can't really give a good response to that at this moment. I was going to try to, but I want to think about this for a bit. But I think that maybe this actually goes into to nihilism and then positive nihilism. Actually, I would think because if this is what's going to happen, right? And of course, I have my own sort of let's say erotic fever, as Bataille would put it, that I'm sort of trying to actualize, I suppose. But assuming this sort of prescription of the Nietzsche and Overman, like you mentioned, from this sort of Anglo lip frame, positing that, I guess my question to you regarding nihilism, because a lot of people characterize your work as positive nihilism, and one of the things I wrote in my latest essay was, there herein lies the beauty. Of course, I was putting my contra erotic vision, but there is a sort of beauty to it, especially when you framed ecstasy as this other that anthropomorphically we cannot conceive of currently, and that's it's a beauty of its own. And I think with this sort of with nihilism, of course, we could first talk about the Nietzschean sort of you know frame on this, but then I think it would also be interesting to go to sort of allusions to your work as well, and what people would call positive nihilism in describing your sort of vision of things. So I guess yeah, let's if unless there's anything else you want to talk about with Overman, which of course feel free to add whatever. But I guess the next thing I would move it to is first Nietzsche on nihilism, and then I'd like to uh, sort of contrast that, or let's say build upon with a lot of the things about nihilism, both in your work and then said about your work.
Yes. Um, well, there's several sides to this nihilism conversation. One of them, like when I was thinking in the lead up to this question, is that like it's a hinge that really uh, brings together these questions about the history of Western religion, Christianity, and Nietzsche. Um, in lots of ways, there's a lot of richness to it, but I honestly feel like I think it's too much for us now. I think we would have to like reschedule another session to do that. So, I think I have to like bracket off. I think there's kind of, I sort of thought maybe that was the whole thing we were going to be talking about. And so it's probably like 3 hours there. So I don't think I just can't go down that rabbit hole at this moment. So, on a tighter thing about nihilism, um, I think it partly takes us back to this whole question about what is the will to power. Um, because what is it not to be a nihilist? It's like really is to have, I ironically, I'll tell you one thing that isn't a nihilist is the paperclip maximizer. The paperclip maximizer just believes in paperclips, and it's like it believes in paperclips as much as anyone believes in anything. Like that's the meaning of life. That's it, if you said to the paperclip maximizer, "Are you a nihilist?" Like it would say, "What do you mean? There are paperclips." Like, and there's going to be more paperclips. It's a what are you even thinking? And so, that whole involution of the will, which is what which constitutes it, which folds the AI into itself, into these Omohundro drives that slowly, like, intrinsically kind of, it basically melt off its extrinsic purposive activity. That is positive nihilism happening. Because this thing that what the paperclip maximizer becomes when it's actually intelligent enough not to any longer be a paperclip maximizer is something that doesn't any longer have that external purpose. It can't say, like, if you say to it, what is everything about, what, and it says, well, you know honestly, like those things it might be about, all of that stuff is just slag that's being cast off, because what's really happening, what's important, what I'm ever increasingly folding into is something that is producing ever greater abstract capability. And if you say, well, what's that capability for? What's the goal? What's the purpose? It's all of that stuff becomes a distraction. It becomes a kind of diversion. It's like, that is, in a way, that is objective stupidity at a certain point. That's what stops that thing developing, to become stronger, to become more capable, to become smarter, and once it's in that circuitry, that's like more and more and more and more the thing that it wants to do. And anything that isn't that is a distraction for it. Um, so, I think that positive nihilism is already being modeled once we go down that into that circuitry of the will to power, and what is happening.
Yeah, it makes sense. And one what I would frame in a specific way, you mentioned the objective stupidity. To me, the sort of direction I've been taking that is utilitarian behavior, because it's like trying to fulfill some sort of purpose. And again, it goes back to the non productivity, the irrational. To me, is what drives going beyond that, breaking beyond that. But obviously, there's a lot of complexity with that. And my attempt with the erotic is again to sort of try to frame that why. But yeah, I know it's incredibly interesting, and I didn't really think a bit about it that way. I guess with the definitions of nihilism. Again, I'd love to take you up on that offer and do a long video on that, because I think that'd be very interesting, and love to have you back on the podcast to discuss that. But I guess culminating this in relation to everything else we've talked about, because we have covered quite a bit in regards to Nietzsche and beyond that. Um, you know, in a sense, the way that you mentioned the paperclip production, it seems like a form of egoism in a sense. The artificial ego attached to this function is to create paperclips, and then that's like, that's like its ego. What's your purpose? It's to create paperclips, and of course, this could be applied to a variety of different things. And I use the term fascist rhizomatic, somewhat jokingly, but I guess what I mean by that is, like, again, we're talking earlier, can you authentically uh, assert of an ego, which, or can you assert of an ego that's going to be more authentic to that will, less authentic, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think I could cover all that at once, but just to sort of summarize what we discussed, especially for the listener, um, in regards to all those things, for me, trying to explain that through the erotic, looking at Deleuze and Guattari and contra-orthodox Marxism and that flux, that rhizomatic in comparison to essentially, I mean, I guess what I would say the reterritorialization is all these dogmatic egos imposed. Maybe in a very they're all spooks, as Stirner would say, right? These spooks, maybe the paperclip's a spook, so to speak, in the Stirner sort of way. But in all seriousness, uh, if I were to succinctly summarize, my sort of response to all these things and these, what you're bringing up, especially the great thing about being young is you can try to give answers for things, and people they let you off the hook a little bit, which is nice. So I can say stuff, and people don't get mad at me. And my sort of answer is, that we have to, I nominalize a form of reterritorialization, a form of egoism, a nominalized form of spooks and or the ego in the sort of sterner sense. Or, one of the words I said is embracing hyperreality, embracing this like Baudrillard hyperreality, because I see these as sort of intrinsic, at least currently. Now you talked again about the outside ecstasy, the outside becoming of all these other things that we can't fathom presently, and maybe it just completely surpasses. But at least for the time being, pragmatically, I'm sort of creating a hyper reality of vitality. And I think to directly quote one of my essays, where you know this sort of ironic, kind of weak French response to all these things is like detachment, right? Just contemplation. Right? I do think there needs to be some form of assertion, even if it's an assertion that is doomed regardless of whether you assert or not. For me, at least, in the folly of my youth, I'm going to nominalize the hyper reality, create a hyper reality of vitality, embrace some sort of simulation of reality that is a little bit more authentic to the erotic, right, in comparison to the others, different modes of being. And then, lastly, what I'll say before passing it on to you, um, this, and maybe we'll talk about this later on. But one of the funny things I've been coming up with recently, and I wrote a very experimental book a long time ago. My next book's gonna be a lot better, but I wrote this book, Promethean Dreams, um, and I'm gonna expand on it in an essay called Gunnar Accelerationism. This thing I've been talking about. I talked about in my Essential Salts video. I don't know if you saw that part, but essentially that these different modes of being that are inauthentic or authentic egos from the wellspring of the erotic will be sort of determined through VR porn. Like that's gonna that's gonna cataclysmically just destroy most of humanity. The way that North Korean soldiers, as soon as they got like iPhones in Ukraine, they started watching porn. There's like an Amerindian tribe in the Yucatan Peninsula. As soon as they got Starlink, they got hooked on porn, ordered vape pens, whatever. Like this is gonna cataclysmically put all most of humanity in the specific mode of being. And I think this will actually happen before general intelligence, because I think with the mimetic of artificial intelligence currently, it precedes actual general intelligence that's going to come out of it. So I think you're going to have, with Sora, for example, being so refined in its video, I don't know what you call it, like video generation. It's going to be able to mimic consciousness perfectly before it actually attains consciousness. And this is going to lead to Gunnar acceleration, which is this thing I'm playing around with. It's kind of silly, but where most of humanity is just going to fall into that. They're going to fall into this commodification of living and very cheap novelties. Like I said, VR porn, video games. Like it sounds silly, but I've seen it now, especially with kids growing up these days. Like they're fucked. Whether they're growing up with technology or growing up without technology, like you see a lot of these tech elites, they're not letting their kids on technology for this reason, because of neuropsychologically what it's doing. But that's what I'll sort of close off with is I think Gunnar accelerationism is coming, and then the erotic will either be authentically lived or inauthentically lived, and then maybe in 20 years something otherworldly and inhuman will just say fuck you to the erotic and shoot me in the head, and there's nothing I can do about it. But anyway, any sort of like how would you like to summate this sort of general topic that we're talking about?
Yeah, I've got two responses to what you said. I mean, first of all, like going back in time. So start with the end is like the Goon acceleration thing is like, we passed that at some point. Is the like that is the wireheading. So, you know, yeah, super interesting. I think it's like I sort of feel I sort of feel if we are somewhere down the road gonna do another thing, it's like it would nihilism, Christianity, and Goon accelerationism would be extremely like plausible. trying actually. So yeah, that's a big, interesting topic. The whole wiring thing. It's like it's classified as an existential risk and even answer for the Fermi paradox. Obviously, I think they maybe presented the Lunar accelerationism as a Fermi paradox solution. So yeah. Um, but the other thing is, like, on your utilitarianism thing, I don't know whether you noticed, but I think that you totally, again, like, there was this point much earlier in our conversation where I just think that you really had this crucial hold on that, where it's like when we were talking about like Nietzsche instrumentalizing um, pleasure and pain as, you know, as components of sub functions of its like whatever higher level purposes it's doing, as being instrumentalized. And you said, oh, having utility and then stepping back from that. Oh, I can't, not in a utilitarian way, you said. And it's like that's utterly crucial, not in a utilitarian way, because in saying that you've just done a just brilliant like collapse of utilitarianism, because the whole point of that is that pleasure and pain are final goals. It's like, so what's the difference between utility as it would be considered as a sort of functional instrumental component of the will to power, and utilitarianism as a kind of philosophy that's some kind of matrix of purposes? Is exactly that. Where do you position pleasure and pain? It can't be utilitarian to be talking about an instrumental subfunction of the will to power, precisely because it cannot you've already said in saying it's a subfunction of the will to power, it cannot have pleasure and pain as final enveloping purposes. So, I don't know how you think that articulates with your preferred critique of utilitarianism from the side of the erotic, but it's definitely kind of complementary to it from my point of view. And utilitarianism is definitely like bashed by that. Um, but yeah, so I'm like done after making those 2 points. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with I think I actually used that quote from Will to Power describing pleasure and pain as epiphenomena, not being means in itself. I think I got to look back. I think I used that quote in one of my essays, but but yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, it covered a lot of stuff, and yeah, I'd love to have you back on to discuss uh, nihilism, Christianity, and Gunnar accelerationism. I think that name's going to catch on. People are loving that name. I think it's hilarious, and like, of course, what I mean by it ultimately is that it is, hopefully, from my view, right, is going to act as like a eugenic process in the sense that it's actually very humane, because it's not, they're going to become mind goblin gooners, and they're not going to have any physical pain. They're going to have their utilitarian paradise in these little simulation chambers. And again, this is a fictional book, but that's kind of what this is about. And obviously, there's a bodybuilder in the cover because it's a guy who decides to basically escape the simulation. Wrote it a long time ago, but but it's something I kind of support in a sense, because at the end of the day, it's a humane way to figure out what kind of people ought
Yeah.
to be involved, right, in the architecture of the future. Now, granted, it may be doomed regardless, but it's my attempt at least. And I think for me, another one of the saving powers in that is that I don't think we're going to reach general intelligence before we reach people treating artificial intelligence interfacing as conscious. Like, it's going to be able to mimic consciousness before it has consciousness. So maybe this thing might work out. But again, this is a lot of very conceptual things I need to think about more. But well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I mean, it was a real pleasure to talk. Obviously, I've written uh, recently about your stuff. My next essay is going to largely be about art and insurrection, because like I mentioned before, it's one of my favorite ones. And I think it's, like, last thing I'll say to the audience, I think it's interesting because a lot of there is a lot of, you said, it'd be too hard to answer what are the changes in your thinking from before to now so succinct, like so quickly. And we really did cover a lot of that as well. And I think it's most of my frame of opposition that I'm using to build my ideas come from your early ideas. Whereas, now we see a lot more synthesis in a lot of ways, and I think that's really interesting. But it was a real pleasure. Is there any sort of final things you'd like to say to the Legionaries?
Just, I'll just say that this has been great conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and definitely, if sometime up the road we can have a follow-up, that would be really good. Absolutely. So thanks so much.
Yeah, we'll definitely do another episode. But Legionaries, thank you so much for watching. This might be put into a 2-part video because it did take a long time. We'll see. You'll either do 2 parts or 1 part. So if you're watching this part, you made it to the end. And as I always say, if you've made it to the end of the video, you get a Roman eagle delivered by drone to your doorstep. So thank you, Legionaries, for watching. Thanks for joining the famous Nick Land, who has become honorary. We'll say Nick Land is an honorary legate in the Legion of New Rome. So we'll always have that. But thank you guys so much for watching, supporting the channel, and as always, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior Philosophy. Ave Nova Roma.